Welcome to ACFID/RDI Network's second webinar in this series for our Disability Inclusive Guide, Research for All, making research inclusive of people with disabilities. So a bit of housekeeping is to please keep muted unless you're speaking or you're in the breakout activity. Please do introduce yourself before speaking, and you're welcome to use the chat box to interact with everybody and including the speakers, and also use the chat box for our Q&A. We are hosting this meeting style rather than webinar style so that we have access to our breakout room function in Zoom. If you have any tech questions, please do private message ACFID Learning on the chat. So if you open up your chat box, there will be an option to choose who you're messaging, and in the drop down box there will be a person or an option called ACFID Learning. And if possible, if you do want to speak, pop your hand up on by using the raise your hand function to indicate that you'd like to speak, and we'll give you an opportunity to do so. And lastly, please note that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to ACFID Learning, ACFID's YouTube channel. So if you have issues with that, please do give me an email or let me know in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a really good time today. So I know that we are all probably zooming in from a bunch of different places, but I am in Melbourne and ACFID is in Canberra. So I would like to at least acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted on the lands of the Kulin Nation as well as on Ngunnawal country, and I wish to acknowledge them. I wish to acknowledge the peoples as the traditional owners of the land. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge if any Aboriginal elders of other communities who might be here today on the workshop. Sovereignty was never ceded. So quickly, before we jump into a very awesome discussion today, I would like to let you know a little bit about the RDI Network. So we are a network of development practitioners, researchers and evaluators, and students as well who are interested in research in the international development field. Our mission at the RDI Network is to support effective and equitable international development through evidence and collaboration, which is why we produce a lot of guides and a lot of work on best practice. Our community, or our network, is open to all individuals with an interest in international development. We send out a monthly newsletter. We have a website with different types of events, including our online events and learning resources. We also have a database for different types of experts, should you wish to reach out to somebody and need their expert opinion. So please do visit www.rdinetwork.org.au. Thanks, Vicky. Oh, I think I've forgotten to introduce everybody. That's what I forgot to do. That was silly of me. I forgot to introduce myself as well. Okay, hi everybody. So I'm Whitney. I'm from the RDI Network, and I am actually the communications coordinator. Vicky, who you may have heard me talk to, is Vicky Wong from ACFID. She's the technical advisor from ACFID, and she's the one being the tech MC today. And shortly after this slide, I will introduce our speakers and guests for today. So what is research all about? Why did we put out this guide? And what are we going to be talking about today? So We developed Research for All, making research inclusive of people with disabilities, is a guide, about a 200-page guide really, that was developed in partnership with Nossal Institute for Global Health, CBM Australia, and the Pacific Disability Forum. We created this guide to ensure that people with disabilities will be included in research and in development research. And within the document, we would like to acknowledge that a lot of the work and a lot of the content that we were using and able to put into the guide is due to the external work of people in the disability rights movement. So hopefully we have been able to continue the legacy of championing disability rights and hopefully to advance disability inclusive research. Today, as I mentioned, is the second webinar of a series of 3. Last 3 weeks ago, we did our very first webinar, which was all about the principles of disability inclusive development. And today we are going to talk about section 2 in the guide, which is all about ethical processes and considerations in the design and implementation of research projects or around development. It is about how do we acknowledge people with disabilities, that they have agency and to conduct and self-determine their own research projects, and as well
can let researchers know exactly what it is that they want researched. But at the same time, there are
additional considerations to ensure that people with disabilities and their rights are protected. And this is due to the power differential between people with disabilities, people without disabilities, researchers, donors, and other development actors. And I'm sure many people understand there is quite a discrepancy. So I think now is a good time to introduce all the guests. So as I mentioned, there is Vicky Wong from Digital Learning. Not Digital Learning, she is the Digital Learning Advisor at ACFID and our awesome tech MC. Thank you for controlling all the controls on Zoom today. And then we have Lana Logan, co-author of Research for All and technical advisor in the Disability Inclusion for Health and Development Unit at Nossal Institute for Global Health. She has a background in cultural studies and educational and developmental psychology. Yay. Thanks for joining us. We also have Dr. Manjula Marella, Senior Research Fellow at Nossal Institute for Global Health as well. Her research is focused on measuring disability and its impact and disability inclusive programming. Thank you for joining us. And we also have Ipo Pawasal, Australian Awards PhD student at Deakin University and chairperson of the Papua New Guinea Assembly of Disabled Persons, PNGADP. Ipo is a strong advocate of disability rights and inclusive development, especially for women. Thank you so much for joining us. Awesome. Oh, and of course myself again is I am Whitney. So let's jump into a really robust discussion of ethical processes and considerations in disability inclusive research. And I guess I'd also like to stress that this isn't just about disability specific research. I think it's really important if we're talking about inclusion is that this is about embedding inclusion within mainstream initiatives as well as disability specific initiatives. So I guess let's jump into our first question, which is, research conducted in lower and middle income countries raises a set of distinct ethical and moral, social and political issues. perhaps what would you say are these issues, Lana, Magella, or Ipol?
Let me start off. I guess for people with disabilities in many of the developing countries, and particularly from indigenous communities, there are issues of culture that can also impact on how you would gain access to conduct research with or about people with disabilities. So when you talk about ethical considerations, how do you access wanting to do research about children with disabilities? Issues of considerations that you need to look at is the culture itself. Children do not speak in communities, particularly from indigenous communities. You speak through their parents. So those are some of the considerations that one needs to be considerate about, particularly when you are thinking about ethics. How do you gain ethics to work with children with disabilities, or about children with disabilities in communities? So the culture and the way you enter, or the culture can determine how you enter into a community. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I think that it builds very much upon what we spoke about in our last webinar, which is this is a lot about relationship building. It's not jump into a community and ask for access. That's very, in a way, I guess, tokenistic in a way. How about you, Manjula, sorry. As a research fellow, what do you think are some of the other ethical and, I guess, political issues that could arise from working with people with disabilities and doing research?
My experience, I think I would start with power dynamics. It plays at two levels, is what I have experienced. Is firstly, from which country you're going as an external, and the relationship, the political relationship between the country you're going to work with, as well as the history of the local country, with whether it is post-colonial kind of a country and things like that. There are two issues like I have faced is, firstly, sometimes people may be like, why is an external organization conducting research in my country? The other aspect is sometimes you're very welcome to do the research, but there is also this local cultural context that they don't want to speak up. And the power dynamics can be that, okay, whatever you say is okay and welcome, and do not want to argue your point or say no. So I think ironing out those power imbalances to start with, and building that relationship and partnership as equal as co-investigators. I think it has to start even before you are entering into the country, when you're actually designing the study itself. How feasible it is, and who are you going to work with, and at what level, what are the roles and responsibilities of each partner organization, including people with disabilities. And that's another layer again within power dynamics, is how people with disabilities are generally treated in their own community context, whether they are, the stigma and discrimination that they have faced, or culturally they might be feeling that they cannot speak up. Or, working with, it is very similar to working in any kind of international development programming, I would say, but making sure that there is meaningful participation of local research partners, whether they are from the university context or any service delivery organization and a DPO. Even within them, there is an understanding of capabilities of each other, roles, what they could contribute to the study. I think having that from the beginning, even when you're proposing a research project, rather than going there with, I have got this funding, can you work with us as partners? I would start with that. I think the power balance, making sure that relationship and trust is built.
Did you want to add anything, Ipol?
Yeah, I think Manjula, brought up the issue of, when you are entering a community, and particularly if you have a disabled people's organization within that area, it's good to work closely with that group. Because a research that we did with Deakin University while I was still back in Papua New Guinea, initially the researcher from Deakin University had gone into the community with one of the core researchers, a person with disability. And whilst people came out, they were not receptive to the team that went there. So because I was actually coordinating the project, I had asked, if the co-researchers could go by themselves. And there were people with disabilities. They speak the language. And so the next day they did go by themselves. And when they came back and they said, oh, the children ran to come and talk to us. So, they could see that they kind of identify with the two co-researchers because they had disabilities. And so when they went in and said, here we are. And because they had gone in the day before, when they went by themselves, the children came forward. And then the parents came and, talked to them. So this was the study with hearing the voices of children with disabilities. So it's really, I think, again, talking about the context, the culture, the socio-political power imbalance or balances within the countries. I think these are areas that we really need to consider when we are going into countries where there may be situations that, whether it's cultural or whether it's political, that would impinge on our research. We need to take into considerations this type of issues when we are planning researches. So involving people with disabilities in the beginning of the project, when you are discussing, and during the process of the project as well.
Thank you. Yes, and I think sometimes, for myself especially, sometimes I can get caught into, I have to involve somebody with a disability, but who knows this exact message that I want to put out? and that in myself is, and I realize, that is my own bias. It's that it's not about finding someone who fits the mold with a disability to talk about the thing that I want them to talk about. It's actually much more collaborative than that. And it's about working to find a common context rather than going, oh, well, here's a token person to do the token thing that I'm doing. Lana, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, something that Ipol mentioned about, children coming up and willing to talk. I think, what both Manjula and Ipol, what they've reiterated, I agree with, that not only are we dealing with power dynamics between countries, we're dealing with power dynamics within local structures, and how to ensure that we really, in that context, that we do no harm, referring not only to our organizational local ethics protocol, but the in-country ones as well. So with that in mind, how we would maintain the privacy and confidentiality of people with disabilities, especially in contexts where sometimes you're, when you're speaking to people, the whole village is sitting with you. Yeah. And how, as Ipol mentioned, that the local ethical protocol might require us to speak. We cannot speak directly with the children or the person with disability. We do need to go through the village head or speak through a carer or a guardian. So a lot of those considerations need to be thought about as well.
Thank you, Lana. And actually that is a great segue to our next slide. So thank you, on informed consent. So you should be loading. Yeah, just loaded on my screen. I'm not sure about yours. But here is a slide that we have included that is in the guide that Research for All. And I think this is quite an important image and graphic that we've included in the guide, and it's called the consent continuum. And it shows, or I'd like to think that it shows that consent isn't a binary process, that it's not a yes or a no, but actually there are shades in between. So for those who may not be able to see this screen, this is a sliding continuum. With the right-hand side, with the left-hand side, there is consent, and right on the other side, on the left, there is force, and in between, there is compliance, pressure, and coercion. And as Lana pointed out, and Ipo pointed out, is that if you're working with the whole village, if you're working through parents, if you're working through carers, maybe, that getting consent might look a lot different. And understanding your place in applying pressure or to, even if it's inadvertent, is really critical in understanding if your research and your processes are ethical. And I would really like to invite our guest speakers. Would you have, hang on, let me read my actual question. Have there been any situations or examples that you have come across in your work that you could share with the audience to illustrate the complexity of informed consent?
Maybe I'll go first. So the informed consent, the major challenge I had is going through the local ethical processes as well. You know, sometimes in some country context, working with certain impairments like intellectual disabilities or children with disabilities, the local ethical processes would not allow you to speak with them directly, like Ipul was mentioning before. So anyone under the age of 18 years, you need to have their parent or guardian as a representative, as a proxy. You couldn't ask the questions directly with them. So going through that complex processes of ethics varies from country context to each country context. The other thing I also found sometimes challenging, which you have to adapt according to the situation and have the processes approved, is different types of consent, like written informed consent versus a verbal consent. Sometimes people do not want to sign a document. They feel insecure in signing a document, but they would rather be willing to provide a verbal consent to your research. So you have these processes already in place of how you engage with different groups and different types of participants. I mean, written consent is not always feasible with many types of groups, including those who cannot read the document. Literacy is also a concern, but having that flexibility as well within the local cultural context. When you're engaging with children, so although the ethical process is strict that you cannot speak with them directly, but they may be allowing, when a parent is sitting with them, then you can have a conversation with both of them together. And there are some guidelines out there. How do you engage that conversation meaningfully with children when conducting research processes? So any researcher wanting to do this kind of, involving children with disabilities or people with intellectual disabilities, they need to be aware and familiar with these processes and guidelines that are out there as a training, but also making sure you are going along with the local ethical guidelines and working in partnership with local DPOs and other partners, relevant stakeholders, to make sure you are able to get reliable and valid information.
Yeah, following on from what Manjula has said, I actually conducted my research back in country for my PhD, and I went into a community in Port Moresby. Whilst I'm not from that community, I've been an advocate for people with disabilities, so they know about me. But when I went into that community, what I had seen was that parents came out, knowing that I was an advocate. They spelled out frustrations about people going in and using people with disabilities. You know, there are organizations that go into the communities, bring the children out, and particularly if it's independence celebration, and they just use them to say that we are contributing, you know, things to them, but the children don't benefit. So when I went in to do my research, they were saying, I hope that you are not here to actually just use our children as, they used the word flower bus. And I sat down and I kind of wanted to know more about why they were not happy. And so they said, you know, many of our children here are just used by organizations. So these are things that we have to be careful about as well. The benefits that they may gain from the research. So what do you give back in return to the reciprocity, you know, the issue of reciprocity and building that relationship. So what do they gain from the research? And so I kind of understood where they were coming from, because those were things that we were talking about within the, you know, the disability sector. So, but that's one of the examples. The other one was when I went to my own province, in my own village with my own tribe. And I wanted to speak with, you know, my cousin who was grown, but he cannot be able to, well, he can talk, but the mother wanted to speak. The mother is my cousin, and she wanted to speak on his behalf. And I said, no, I want to talk to your son. And she said, okay, we'll come back later. And they never came back. Now, the issue of tribal integrity also is a factor so that we need to think about, because sometimes when you're entering a community where, particularly for my country, which is an indigenous community where people with disabilities used to be looked after, they used to be protected, but now are exposed because of the socio-political, socio-economic, you know, the changes in the socio-economic culture that we have moved on. You know, it's monetary culture now. It's no longer about looking after, but it's, you know, survival of the fittest, whatever it is. And so they don't want to have this bad name. And people, you really need to understand, or they really need to know why you're going into the community. What is the benefit to people within that community? Is it going to spoil their name, you know, bad name? So this is some of the issues. So even though I'm from that community, I was faced with those type of issues too.
Thank you. Thank you for being so open about that and sharing that with us. I guess it's also that's prompted a question from me. You can stop sharing the slide now. Thank you, Vicky. I think that the question that comes up for me is then, what practical ways can us researchers see people with disabilities and make sure that people with disabilities don't feel like they're being used? Like, what practical things could we be doing to actually make sure that research is accessible to them? Or what is it from the research do they want, or do people with disabilities want to have back?
I think it's when you are developing research or when in the design phase of the research, it's good to work with the DPOs within the countries, and they can be able to point out, you know, what are some of the challenges that you might face with, you know, the cultures. And I guess this is what, you know, the two projects that we have held as from PNG-ADP with CBM NOSOL, the Road Accessibility Project, and with Deakin University on the children's Voices of Children with Disabilities, that when they came through the DPOs, and we actually co-facilitated the research in country, that it went well because we understood the context and we were able to assist in planning the research from the beginning to the end of the project. So working closely with DPOs in the country would really help in paving out, you know, the way forward, and, you know, maybe having an effective research that, because they understand the context on the ground. So within the Pacific, you know, you go through Pacific Disability Forum, and Pacific Disability Forum would, you know, send you to all the DPOs in each of the countries within the Pacific.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to add, to what Ipul is saying, that ownership of the project, whether it is from an external organization or the internal organization, local organization that is conducting, if you do not have them engaged meaningfully throughout the research cycle, from the planning phase to data collection and analysis and reporting, it's not just about having people with disabilities as participants or at the time of, or data as data collectors. It is about meaningfully engaging them throughout the planning process of the study design, implementation of it, and even during the analysis and reporting as well. There are things that you might be looking at it very differently to a person with disability when they are engaged in that analysis process. And I mean, not necessarily you need to expect that DPOs should have technical knowledge of how you conduct analysis, but it is that sharing those preliminary data and findings with them and doing it, engaging them at every stage. It is also building that quality way of interpreting the findings, and also that giving back to the community, and that building that ownership of that data of the research project and what it could do for their own community.
It also helps. I think it also helps them to be better advocates, because at least they have that informed research. They know what it is, how it can help them to be good change agents.
Yeah. I mean, this is what we have done in most of our research is, even if we have done all the technical aspects of the data analysis, we conduct workshops with the local partners, including people with disabilities, how to interpret those findings that is meaningful for the local context and what can be done next as next steps to plan with them. So that builds ownership. It's not just about the understanding of the research, but ownership of that content as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, I think that's a really important point, I think, because for myself, I do a lot of workshops, that involve a lot of different people, and I'm just there to listen to the patterns of what is being spoken about, and I'm just there to collect the themes of what's being spoken. But I'm not the one speaking, and while they might not have, the people that I engage with might not exactly have the expertise in whatever it is that I'm doing, what I'm there to do is just ask open questions and listen. And that's how I'm informed, whether they have expertise in statistics or designing things or communication products. Just looking at the time, I might quickly ask one last question to Lana before we go into our breakout activities. Just quickly, Lana, as co-author of Research for All, what was the goal of developing this guide, and what do you think is the most valuable aspect of this guide, which is also available online and offline? And if you would like a copy, please do email us because we can arrange delivery to you.
Thanks, Whitney. Well, our goal in developing this guidance is, of course, to support development researchers and practitioners to ensure inclusion of people with disability throughout research. It's well known that people with disability have been excluded from research, and in turn, humanitarian initiatives and development. And as long as this remains the case, then obviously development will not be effective. And amongst development practitioners and researchers, although there is a commitment to address this gap, but we also acknowledge that we're not all we're on different phases of our journey, and some practitioners and researchers may have limited experience working with people with disability. So as that may have been a hurdle or a reason in the past why they haven't included people with disability in research. And as a bit of a background between CBM and USL, we were getting quite a lot of help desk requests for advice on inclusive research. And then we did a bit of a scan to see what was out there, what guidance was out there. And although there were guidance that were available for specific types of impairments, what emerged as a real gap was this guidance for including people with disabilities in cross-cultural contexts. And really, given the context that we all work in, it really emerges the need. So we wanted to develop something that was really practical and useful that people would really use. And in terms of what I find really useful, in this guidance, although we highlight key considerations across the research cycle for meaningful and ethical inclusion, there's really no one way of doing this. There's no prescriptive formula for doing this. Every research project will have its own unique requirements and challenges. So I guess what I really like about it is how the guidance have documented disability inclusive research that have been conducted as a way to illustrate how specific projects have approached these considerations. So, you know, it's something that we may initially be like, oh, this is way too hard. How do you conduct SRA, sexual reproductive health research amongst women with disabilities in a Catholic country? Like, there's so much to consider. And through these case studies, we'll see the possibilities emerge. And so I'm really hopeful to see, as you said earlier, Whitney, the legacy being continued forward through this guidance.
Oops, I was on mute. The catch call for Zoom these days. Thank you so much for that answer, Lana, and it was really awesome to work with you as well on this guidance. And so let's, now that we've had our last question in the plenary, let's go into our activities for the breakout room. So the breakout activity is to engage in colleague questions in conversation with each other to facilitate a deeper understanding of disability inclusive development, and as well, as always, to facilitate change. Whether that is just for yourself, today you've learned something that you will apply to your research, or whether you manage a team and you will implement some different policies and guidelines when you're working with another group of people. So the structure will be, all the attendees will be randomly split into small groups via the breakout rooms. And to let you know, the breakout rooms are not recorded. Each room each activity will be about 25 minutes, because I think I am running late. And each presenter and guest that we've had here will be facilitating your breakout room. And the activities that we have two activities this webinar today. And the activities sorry, Vicky, can you change to the next slide, please? Activity 1 is about discussing whether something is informed consent or not. And some of the scenarios that you will get are deliberately vague, because I'm hoping that you'll have a conversation. And activity 2 is about ethical considerations for a specific case study in the guide. Don't worry, we do have all of this up on a screen for you. Each facilitator will have a link for you that to Google Slides, where you will be able to type directly onto the document. Does anyone have, Lana will be hosting Q&A, but I can't find Lana at the moment.
I'm here. Can you see me? Hi. Yeah, so if anyone has a question, please, about ethical considerations in including research, including people with disabilities in research, please put it in the chat box.
Tessa actually would like to ask a question.
Sure. Okay. So Tessa, would you like to ask your question?
That'd be great. Thank you. I just wanted to ask how, because I've been reading the document and it's great. I love it. But throughout, I think there was sometimes a bit of overlap in what you're thinking about ethical considerations for research participants and then ethical considerations for co-researchers. And then I just wondered I just was interested in how you've approached the writing of this document with those two groups in mind and how you distinguish between them, particularly because, I mean, some of the inclusivity will obviously apply to everybody, but some of the more complex things like payment and stuff will be different according to, you know, which group those people are in. So I'd just be interested in what your thinking was behind that.
Sure. I think so. When we drafted this guidance, we had a lot of input from the steering committee who suggested that we limited the scope of the guidance, basically. And as it is, it's designed for research practitioners and practitioners and researchers to use. It's not kind of intended for DPOs to use. DPOs can certainly use it as a way to kind of, there is a guidance actually that exists for DPOs conducting research, and we do link to it in the guidance. In terms of, was your question around how we distinguish co-research, the considerations around co-researchers and participants? Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Yeah.
So I think with the co-researchers, there were considerations for what we had to kind of look out for in the process. So it is those things like, have we addressed all potential barriers to inclusion? And so they're kind of the things that the research team really needs to consider, with input from DPOs, of course, as the DPOs being co-researchers. And with the participants, so there would be considerations of what are there unintended negative consequences that could result as from participating in this research. Yeah, I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
No worries.
Could I ask a question that's just related to the question that Tessa also just had?
Sure.
So firstly, just to say, I thought it was very helpful to have this to have these guidelines. I noticed there was a section in there also about choosing DPOs and what you have to be aware of when you are selecting DPOs, because there can be issues there as well. I mean, some DPOs could be very aligned with state structures, and some could be more independent, for example. And there's a whole host of other issues I'm sure participants in this forum would be aware of how to choose working with, which kinds of DPOs to work with. You know, I mentioned this in the breakout session as well. Even though this is not designed for DPOs, it would be empowering for DPOs to actually read this document, because they understand what are the best practices they should be expecting to see from their more powerful, much better resourced, often Western-based counterparts who would be approaching them. Usually that's the way it goes, it's a one-way, approaching them to say, look, we want to do this research and will you do it with us? And for the DPOs to know, these are the standards which ideally should apply. And then it's up to them to decide, right? I mean, what's culturally appropriate or not. But I just thought that would be very helpful if this could also be made more widely available in the developing countries in which we all work. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sahabia. I think you're absolutely right. It's it was mentioned elsewhere. I can't quite remember where, but that this resource is could be very useful for DPOs, for them to kind of know what the standards are and negotiate then with research partners as to what they expect. And with regards to your first question on choosing DPOs, I might let Ipul answer that yes, Ipul, would you be able to answer Zahabia's first question, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sorry, what's your name again? Zahabia?
Yeah. Zahabia? Yes, you got it right the first time. Zahabia.
Okay, yeah, it's very important that you pointed that one out because, within countries, there are organizations that may be individual people with disabilities that might call themselves a DPO. But that DPO is a national representative body for people with disabilities in a country. So it's really important to understand who the DPOs, the real DPOs are. So within the Pacific region, we usually would say, if you don't know who a DPO is in a country, you go to Pacific Disability Forum because we are part of that movement. Internationally, a national DPO is aligned to the Disabled People's International, DPI. But then in countries, you have specific DPOs, these aligned disability organizations. So it may be Psychiatric Survivors Association. It is a specific line DPO. So areas in psychiatric studies, or violence, or those areas. Or you may have people with, intellectual disability. They might form their own organization. So that's also a DPO, but it's a line disability. But usually they would be affiliated to the main, cross disability DPO, which is a national body. But again, your point about it is good for DPOs to understand this. It's actually important because a lot of, the DPO movement is just a new movement that has just arrived into the Asia Pacific region, particularly. And for the Pacific region, it's only in the, in the late 90s and in the 2000s in this century. So I guess for us, we are guided by Pacific Disability Forum. So there is that, peak body that, provides training and support to us. So usually we would say, if for organizations working within the region, if you want to work with a region, you go through the Pacific Disability Forum, they will identify. But if you are in country, it's also good to go through that as well. And they will identify DPOs in the country. Again, going back to your comment about, the DPO should understand the guidelines is important as well, because there are groups that are just emerging that are just wanting to get, take advantage of what's coming. And so if you are not careful, or if the DPOs are not aware of the criteria and that is within that, then I don't know, the research might not go well. That's just a caution that I would give to. So, and this is something that within our country, because I was the inaugural leader within the movement in Papua New Guinea, and maybe because my experience in research helped me to guide along, the research that were proposed, to work with DPOs in the country, with Melbourne Uni, with NOSOL Institute Partnership, and with Deakin University. So this is some of, I think your point is quite valid, that this DPOs needs to also get this guidelines so they understand what the criteria are.
Thank you so much, Ipul. I would just add to that. So we mentioned earlier how meaningful participation throughout the research cycle would really require that partnership with DPOs. But it may be the case that the local DPOs don't have that academic background, so usually projects might require a kind of a project needs assessment to see what are the current skills within the DPOs, what are the current skills of the research team, what then needs to be built up. So it's not as a top-down, that neo-colonial, this is what we know, let's tell you what we know. It's that kind of, what can you teach us that we're really missing out. So for example, in Indonesia, you can't pass through conducting research on sexual reproductive health in Indonesia is very, very difficult. So without that input from a local partner and around how to frame the ethics and the research question and so on, you know, it'd be a complete failure. So that kind of training on the research ethics and process, we would kind of need to do together. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I think some of the projects do that, you know, like our research with National Institute, Melbourne Uni. We did go through that, you know, so they understood the research ethics and they, you know, what is required. And so the co-researchers, you know, are trained in those areas as well. So from the beginning, it's good to do that with them. So from the planning of the research to the evaluation of the data.
Thank you, Ipul. There's a question from France Pitt in the chat box. France, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so my question is that I'm conducting an evaluation. It's a formative evaluation of some workshops to disseminate information. I'm conducting this evaluation for and with a DPO in Melbourne, and I'll be including adult people with disabilities as co-researchers and in an advisory panel. And I was wondering, should I seek written consent from them to participate, or can I assume that their choice to participate constitutes consent? Or is it consent, or is it contextual? And I was wondering what your thoughts are and what your different opinions might be.
Thank you, France. Manjula, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned the DPO is a co-research, the members of the DPO are co-researchers. So I assume they are co-investigators with you, and there would be some participants as well. Or are you expecting them as participants?
They will be participants. Do you mean like informants?
I didn't quite understand your question. I'm sorry. You said they're co-researchers who are co-investigators, which you do not need an approval process for consent.
Okay.
But if you are collecting information from them and using the information that they share as your data for your evaluation, for example, then you would need to have a consent process.
Okay.
And it will on the context, and like someone was also mentioning, Karen also was mentioning about, depends on the impairment type and that they have. So it really depends what your research is aiming at, whether they are co-researchers investigating something with you, or they are research participants as well. So depending on that, and whether it is a written informed consent or an assent, it really depends on your the nature of your research, I suppose. Yeah.
Great, that's really helpful, because the answer is both of those scenarios. They will be co-researchers and they will be participants or informants.
Then I would say you would need some consent processes, but are you going, if it also depends on the type of institutional review board you would be going with and following those guidelines as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Manjula. I can't see any more questions in the chat box. So I might ask Manjula and Ipul my own question. So we know that the impact of research can be positive and unintentionally negative. Can you let me know some key ethical considerations? What do researchers and practitioners need to think about? Like, what are those some of those unintended negative consequences, and what do we always need to think about? Anyone?
I'm just thinking.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, the question is unintended negative consequences that we should be careful about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, for me and the experience, and I think it's also mentioned in the guidelines as well, the document as well, is not having the understanding on disability as a concept and what is meaningful participation. Like we were talking a little bit about tokenistic participation. You have a person with disability on board, whether it is advisory or as a co-researcher, but are they meaningfully engaged in the process? If the local partner, we did have these issues on some research projects when we are engaging with a local university, for example, and a DPO, they both have their own challenges in understanding each other's capabilities and how much they will be valuing each other's roles. Like, for example, when we started with this particular research, the university was hesitant about how can DPO be a co-researcher on this project, researching with us. What are their capabilities? Mm-hmm. And the DPOs are going through this. That how can we work with a university who have no idea about disability and disability inclusion? So if those things are not addressed to start with, if we had not identified those issues were happening, there may be certain things the way each partner would have acted might have had certain unintended consequences and tension in the country of how the research is conducted. Because we wanted them as co-researchers implementing the research project. They kind of owned the whole project. We were driving with them, but they owned it. And they had to lead it. That's how the whole design was going to be. It wouldn't have worked if we didn't handle those issues carefully and establish that trust and partnership between the local partners carefully. And once that trust was built, they are now working on several other projects together as well. It was not just about the research project that we were doing. And obviously, both of them had to train in different concepts, certain research aspects for DPO members that were co-researching with us, as well as disability inclusion concepts for the university staff, for example. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if that understanding is not there and that trust is not there, that could lead to certain unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point that you've pointed out. And I think that was one of the challenges we faced with the road project when it was first intended to be led by a university, but I guess because they didn't have that experience with working with people with disabilities, and that research actually took a while for the research to get on or to start. So, and the DPO took it on. So it is really important, the point you pointed out, Manjula, that in there really needs to be that understanding at the initial stage of the project between the research, the participants, or between the informants and the co-researchers, the proponents of the project. Now the other area was, I guess, within the projects as well, when the project is actually running. An example that we came across where, the treatment of people with disabilities, there were issues that came out from this research that we had, where people started to talk about how people with disabilities were treated, and the abuse that they children with disabilities had undergone, being locked up for several years. And so this was something that we didn't know how to handle because the DPO was leading the research. So we had to discuss with the university as to how we can best handle this situation, because this was an issue that requires the law people to come in and handle it as well. So some of the unintended things that would come out, and it created some kind of we didn't want to go straight to handle the issue. We really need to look at where are the pathways, what are the pathways that we can be able to raise these issues to who do we report it to. So when you're with DPOs on the ground, it's really important to, inform them as to how best you can handle the situations as well.
Yeah, that's really big. And I've just noticed the time, so actually I'd like to wrap up quickly and say thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everybody attending. Thank you, Ipo. Ipo, thank you, Mandrula, thank you, Lana, and thank you to all the attendees. Vicky, there will be a feedback form, feedback survey. If you could please fill that out, that would be really great. That will help us shape our next webinar. So in the chat, there is a little link. So please give us your feedback. And again, wrapping up on time. Thank you again, Lana. Thank you again, Mandrula and Ipo. And thank you everybody for attending. And if you need, this video will be put up soon-ish on YouTube, and we'll email you a link. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.